At Wigmore Hall, we are now reaching a global audience through our live streams, connecting exceptional artists with music lovers in homes all over the world. Now audiences everywhere can experience the vital and unifying power of music from this most intimate hall in London. Each of these broadcasts requires at least £3,000 in addition to regular concert costs. We want to make sure they remain available for free to everyone. If you are able to, please help us by donating each time you watch. What makes Wigmore Hall special is the sense of community it inspires, and this continues to thrive thanks to the spirit of your generosity. Please support us today. Your gifts are making all the difference.
Thank you. Thank you for coming out at such an antisocial hour. I understand there are some fast food eateries in the country where they're playing Beethoven to keep away youth gangs. And I must congratulate the Wigmore Hall on having succeeded comprehensively. Let me deal first of all with the sick list. I've been unwell all week on heavy medication, so I'm going to have to talk to you sitting down, which I don't like doing. But let's hope we can get through the next hour together. That's how it is. John Gilhooly, the manager of this hall, is unable to attend because he's had a minor procedure and he is watching us from home. Hello, John. What you should know is that John is one of the great COVID heroes. He kept this place open right the way through COVID, through the lockdowns, through everything. When he couldn't let an audience in, he sneaked the artists in from the back. And they performed here to an empty hall, and it was live streamed around the world. And one of those who appeared on this stage during that time was me, talking about my previous book, Genius and Anxiety. And John said to me at the time, he said, next time we'll do you a full hall. So here we are, and thank you, John. Thank you all for attending. Thank you especially, I see there are one or two previous Beethoven biographers who are in the audience who've had kind words to say about the book, which I'm really grateful for. And there are also half a dozen Ukrainian refugees who were studying with my wife Elby, and who were actually, their class this morning was on the first page of Why Beethoven. So we've already penetrated Ukrainian culture. Why Beethoven? It's a statement, not a question. When I started to write this book, I assumed that Beethoven was not knowable. And that's a reasonable assumption, because nobody in his own time thought they knew him, and various others have come along since and have tried to penetrate the very, very, very thick fortresses that Beethoven built around him, have also come away with a similar conclusion. But using modern resources, using technology, using various tools, I think I started to begin to enter different worlds of Beethoven. First of all, in the last decade, an awful lot of manuscripts and letters have become available online. So instead of having to rummage in dusty archives, you can pull them up on your screen, you can follow Beethoven's hand down the page. And there is nothing like that in order to get into an artist's mind. I've also used other tools, musicology, psychology, medical history, various things just to try and find where this man was without, even at the earliest stage, accepting the common image of him as a curmudgeon, someone who never changed his shirt, who didn't own a jacket. I mean, they had to run out and buy him a jacket so he could conduct the Ninth Symphony. Who kept people away in all sorts of ways. He was rough in his behavior, he was rude, he was reckless, he was of course deaf, which made it even more difficult to communicate with him. And many people, many visitors complained of his unpleasantness. He also, in order to keep away those self-same visitors, he would sometimes forget to empty the chamber pot beneath his chair. So the people who came knocking on Beethoven's door left pretty soon afterwards. Beyond that, one sees someone so dedicated to something. I don't want to say his art. I don't want to say the betterment of humanity. So dedicated to something, I can't say what it is because Beethoven doesn't define it for us. But we'll come perhaps a few steps closer to it. A man so dedicated that he doesn't waste a minute in his life. A little bit after hours, he might have a glass of wine. But that's about it. He is so fixated on what he does that he never sees the sea. I mean, can you imagine? You're an artist, you want to know the world, you've got invitations from all over the place. At least double your toes in the sea. Nothing. If you look at the biography of Beethoven, there's very little to tell. He only lived in two places, in Bonn and in Vienna. And in Bonn, he had a very hard time. His father was an alcoholic, beat his mother, beat him and his brothers, refused. Beethoven had to take him to court after his mother died in order to obtain maintenance for his brother's upkeep. Beethoven, at the first opportunity, got himself into the ruler's orchestra, cannily playing the viola because he knew that that was the ruler's favorite instrument. So he's playing viola in the orchestra in Bonn, and this is the beginning of his musical life, and guess what? He never once writes a piece for viola. So when you pull these things together, you start to see a man who has very, very strong views of himself and the world, and who is resolute in all of his activities, almost binary, and who never looks back. When he goes to Vienna, he never goes back to Bonn. Done with Bonn. When he goes to Vienna, he finds himself in a den of iniquity. Mozart has died, it's 1792, Mozart has died the year before, Vienna's looking for the next Mozart, they see Beethoven, they think, oh, got one here. Except he's not, he's Beethoven, and he's not going to have any of that. But the aristocracy are all over him, and he agrees to an offer from a man called Prince Karl Lichnowsky, who offers him a suite of rooms in his house, who offers to buy him a Guarnerius and a Stradivarius, which he does, and who says, you know, to make my house at your disposal, be my guest. And Beethoven accepts. And he soon discovers the underside of things. Vienna is a world center of depravity and debauchery. Before very long, one of the chamberlains at the prince's household offers his wife to Beethoven for sexual relief. I mean, Beethoven, who is firstly very removed from sex, and secondly, very, very moral in his outlook, he's appalled. He then discovers that Lichnowsky makes assignations with his own wife in a brothel, because a brothel is the only place where he can obtain arousal. And this is just completely common in Vienna. We know that in Prince Esterhazy's orchestra, Esterhazy was Haydn's patron. Two of the musicians were persuaded to give up their 12-year-old daughters to be deflowered by members of the noble household. Beethoven recoils from all of this. He struggles, and this is probably the formative struggle of his life. He struggles to keep himself apart from the corruptions of humanity, while at the same time doing what he can to find a public, appeal to a public, do the things that he wants to do. The incident with Lichnowsky is fascinating both for what it is and for how it ends. Lichnowsky invites Beethoven to come to his Czech chateau, where he has a weekend party, as one does. And Beethoven comes in and discovers that the place is full of French occupation officers. The Austrians were very ambivalent in their attitudes to the French. They were one day in favor, one day against. Beethoven loathes them. What are these people doing here? Lichnowsky says to Beethoven, will you play the Second Symphony that you've dedicated to me? Beethoven, the orchestra, play the Second Symphony. Everybody's pleased. Then Lichnowsky says to Beethoven, now Lichnowsky is court chamberlain to the emperor of the Holy Roman Empire. He's not an insignificant figure. At one point, it is suspected that he was running the secret police. We don't have proof of this, but there is rumor. Lichnowsky says, play something new for my guests. Beethoven says, I don't do requests. Lichnowsky says, you know, it could be unpleasant for you if you don't do that, meaning, look at me, I'm the court chamberlain, I could make your life difficult. Beethoven picks up his chair, throws it into the audience, and storms out into the night, where it's pouring with rain. He walks 5 kilometers to the nearest town, knocks at the door of the doctor. This was before NHS. You didn't have to go through triage. And knocks through the doctor's door, begs for shelter for the night, gets the carriage to Vienna the next morning, and on reaching home, takes down Lichnowsky's plaster cast from his mantelpiece and smashes it to the ground. Lichnowsky returns a few days later and sends for Beethoven, demanding an apology. Beethoven goes to see him. Lichnowsky says, what do you think you were doing? Beethoven says, don't bother me with all of this. There are plenty of princes in the world. There's only one Beethoven. And he's right, because the implications of this, I mean, that catch line, that goes viral. Everybody in Vienna hears that, even the ones who are deaf. And before very long, Lichnowsky has a younger brother, Count Moritz, who comes to Beethoven and says, look, I'm sorry about my brother. Could you write 3 pieces for me? Of course, yep. Beethoven writes the pieces and says, in effect, to my dear friend, Count Moritz Lichnowsky, these are especially for you and certainly not for your brother. That's in brackets. There is an ending to this. Lichnowsky falls from power. It's about 1810, 1811. And he's starting to reflect on his life, and it's not good. I haven't told you the whole story about Lichnowsky and Mozart, which is, he was a contributory factor in Mozart's death. He'd taken Mozart on a tour. Mozart ran out of money. Lichnowsky gave him the money. When they got back to Vienna, Lichnowsky took him to court for it. And Mozart was so devastated by this. He was already weakened, but it undermined him, and he died 2 months later. So this Lichnowsky has a lot to reflect on and a lot to repent. And one day he comes, and Beethoven sees him coming up the path and locks the door. Lichnowsky knocks on the door, no answer. He sits down on the step outside, waiting for Beethoven to come out. Beethoven doesn't come out. After an hour or two, he goes away. Comes back the next day. Sits on the step. Same story. 3 or 4 times. Finally, Beethoven said, "What do you want?" He said, "I just want you to say good morning to me." Beethoven says, "Good morning, goodbye." In doing so, he has completely overturned the relationship between patron and composer. The power has gone. It's gone from the man with the money, and it's gone to the man with the music. Beethoven has done that by sheer force of will, by sheer principle, and by sticking to the things that he knows he has to do. If you're wondering why there's nobody at the piano, I'm just about to introduce Alim Beisembayev. Alim, some of you will know, is the winner of last year's Leeds International Piano Competition. A fabulous artist. Some of you may have been at his debut recital here last month. He is from Kazakhstan, but he went to school in the home counties, so that's all right. And he plays the most wonderful Beethoven. So may I please introduce, if I'm being heard backstage, may I please introduce Alim Beisembayev to play the first of our pieces. Oh boy, I think I can go home now. Many of you will recognize that piece, yes? The name is Rage Over a Lost Penny. Was that Beethoven's title? It's 50-50. What happened was in November 1827, they did a fire sale of Beethoven's effects at his house in Vienna. And while others were rummaging through his personal detritus, the publisher Diabelli saw this manuscript and thought, yeah, looks all right. Yeah, we can make something of that. And he gave it the title Rage Over a Lost Penny. We don't know if that was the title on the manuscript, but it became an instant hit. Everybody wanted to try it. I mean, really, it's not a piece you should try at home. I think one of the reasons for its popularity was that it represented the public image of Beethoven as being gruff and deterrent and loud and not penetrable and monolithic. But when we start looking into the psychology of it, we come up with some interesting avenues. There is a student of Freud called Theodor Reich, who fell out with Freud, as most of them did. And I came across him because he wrote an important essay on Mahler's Second Symphony. But he also wrote on the Rage on the Lost Penny. And Reich's first assumption, he says, in this comic rondo, a man is driven to uncontrollable fury by losing a small coin under a piece of furniture. He ends up, after much bother, helplessly laughing at himself. Right. There was one media magnate of whom it was rumored that after visitors left his office, he would go around and fish down the back of the sofa to see if they'd left any coins behind. Neither here nor there. What Theodor Reich writes is, it emerges from violent impatience and expresses itself in the numerous variations of the initial theme, making fun of the composer's unreasonableness. If that's the case, this is Beethoven sending himself up, lacerating his public image of indomitability, standing at a distance from his own work in the way no composer has ever done before. Beethoven, says Reich, could not manage his temper. As a matter of fact, one can't even say he lost control because he had none. Reich breaks down Rage Over the Lost Penny into two parts, one being the outburst itself, and the other being Beethoven standing outside of it, mocking his own actions with a detachment that is not only certifiably sane, but which shows a phenomenal degree of self-awareness. The piece dates from the 1790s, and it's a period in which Beethoven is suspected of an obsessive-compulsive disorder. There's an awful lot of psychiatry written about Beethoven, and I try and deal with it briskly in the book. Some of it is useful, and some of it is warm air. Beethoven does not go with the fashion. He does not do what he's expected to do. He does not respect his superiors. He does not even respect his teachers. Haydn, who has been infinitely kind and patient with him, says to him over his first published work, a set of piano trios, says, "Please, Beethoven, would you dedicate your first work to me?" Beethoven said no. Eventually, Opus 9 gets dedicated to Haydn. Beethoven makes the rules. You have to admire this, don't you? You have to realize that this is a person of such immense character that you really want to be with him. You really want to live with him. And at the time that I was writing this, which is in the middle of COVID, when we each had our own lockdown, one couldn't help but empathize with Beethoven in his own lockdown of deafness, in his own separation from the world, which sets in 1800, 1801. It's the worst thing that could possibly afflict a musician. But one comes into his world through that sense of isolation, and one sees where it is that he's going. Now, in Vienna, there is a fad at this time for variations. Do you remember the fad for Gregorian chant? It was a bit like that. You know, one record label had a hit, and suddenly everybody was doing Gregorian chant. Well, this was basically it in Vienna. One composer wrote some variations. Somebody said, "I can do better variations on your theme," and so there would be a contest, and there would be a shootout, and blah, blah, blah. Beethoven refused. Beethoven said no. Eventually, he was persuaded because there was an upstart, an imposter coming in from Prague, and they said, "The pride of Vienna hinges on this. You, Beethoven, are going to have to defeat this man with your variations." "I don't do variations." "Oh, fine." The other man comes in, and he is surrounded by adoring society wives, and he plays his set of variations and then hands it over to Beethoven. Beethoven turns his score upside down. Fingers out a few themes, and then goes off on a riff of variations. And the poor man says, the poor contestant says, "Do not ever put me in a room with that man again." But Beethoven, having got that little tweak, then gets into a rage of variations. He then goes, he'll write variations on anything. He writes variations on God Save the King. He writes variations on Rule Britannia. Any little tune he hears. He writes some political variations. Salieri, who was Mozart's rival, is still around. Beethoven thinks, might be a good idea to do a set of variations on a Salieri theme, little realizing that, of course, the piece that he wrote had so much more music than anything that Salieri had put into his opera. So he's writing variations after variations after variations after variations, and then he stops. This is Beethoven. He always knows when to stop. He can come out of it. And this is why I reject the notion of obsessive-compulsive disorder, because he just stops. He knows his own mind. He does it. So what we're going to hear now from Alim is the beginning of a set of variations without opus, numbered 80 without opus, which comes from this period in the middle of the 1790s. C minor. That was only 3 of the variations. You can try the rest at home. We have a major mountain coming up, so this is a taster for what is yet to come. When I say Beethoven always knows when to stop, he writes 10 violin sonatas, finishes them by 1810. Violin and piano sonatas, never writes another. Doesn't look back. He has no doubts, apparently, about what it is that he's doing. His self-criticism is so acute that he can stand back from his own work and know when it's not up to standard. He has doubts. This is the philosopher Theodor Adorno who points it out. He has doubts about the Pastoral Symphony because, as we all know, the ending's not right, is it? It leaves you, after having had this whole story of the countryside, and man goes out and it rains and there's thunder and lightning, and then he hears a nightingale, and that's nice, and then sun comes out again and he goes home and everybody's happy ever after. Beethoven's not happy with the piece. Beethoven is not happy at all, and the ending tells you that. You look into that ending and it's indeterminate. Beethoven doesn't do indeterminate endings. All of the other major symphonies, Eroica, 4th, 5th, 7th, certainly 9th, end with a clear and unambiguous statement. The Pastoral Symphony fizzles out, fades out. It may be he had some other intention there, or it may be he was simply unable to fulfill his intention. Through most of his composing years, he was writing piano sonatas. Sometimes he got bored and gave up after 9 minutes. You know, the short ones. Sometimes he went off on attack and produced something marvelous and beyond marvelous. But he knew when to stop. When it came to the Hammerklavier, Opus 106, Beethoven said, "That's it." But a publisher came along and said, look, Beethoven, we know you are paying horrendous legal costs over the battle for custody of your nephew. We know you haven't got 2 shillings to rub together. Why don't I give you a contract for 3 more piano sonatas, and then we'll call it quits, and you'll have a bit of money in your pocket. And so he does. Opus 109, Opus 110, and Opus 111. And once again, when he finishes Opus 111, he stops. Nothing. No more piano sonatas. Only one more work for piano, which is the Diabelli variations, right at the very end. But Beethoven always knows where to stop. Now, in Opus 111 is one of the great enigmas in music. It's only got 2 movements. Why? If this is going to be your last sonata, just, flesh it out, do it. Beethoven? No. The first movement is identifiably Beethoven. Proudly and vociferously Beethoven. And the second goes somewhere else completely. And we are following Beethoven into a realm where you feel that no traveler has ever gone before. There is also a subtext to this. I'll discuss some of it a little bit later. There is also a subtext to this, which is about 3 minutes in. Beethoven starts rocking. He gives complex rhythms that sound almost like jazz. They're not European rhythms. We've never heard anything like this before in European music. Beethoven is drawing on something else, some other influence, some other ethnicity, and I've written recently about questions of his ethnicity. But in doing it, he then takes us into the realm of the impermeable. So Alim is going to play us the second movement of Opus 111. We're running out of time, so I'll keep it very brisk. Where is Beethoven going here? Only he knows. There is the Czech writer Milan Kundera writes about Opus 111 as being a kind of last connective moment with his father, distinguished musicologist Ludwig Kundera, at a time when his father was declining into dementia. Kundera writes, once he called me into his room. The variations from the Opus 111 sonata were open on the piano. Look, he said, pointing to the music. He'd lost the ability to play the piano. And again, look. And then after a prolonged effort, he managed to say, now I know. He kept trying to explain something important to me, but the words he used were completely unintelligible. And seeing that I did not understand him, he looked at me in amazement and said, that's strange. Kundera says, I could not forgive myself for asking him so little, for knowing so little about him, for losing him. He calls the ending of the Arietta of the Opus 111, that second infinity, the infinity of internal variety concealed in all things. And that's what you have in Beethoven. No composer is so susceptible to variety of interpretation. Nobody writes music that can fit to all times and all temperaments and all artists. You know, the four great Soviet pianists, Sviatoslav Richter, Emil Gilels, the two Marias, Greenberg and Yudina, they all have the same teacher in Moscow, Gendrit Neuhaus, who was himself a fabulous Beethoven pianist. You would think that they would have something in common. Listen to their recordings of the Opus 111, and only the notes are the same, nothing else. Beethoven fits us at any time, at any moment. He is there to do what we make of us. A friend of mine, consultant oncologist, devout and practicing Jew, said to me when he saw the title, he said, why Beethoven? That's obvious. I said, go on. He said, he's Moses on the mountain. He receives it from the source. And I thought, yeah, you've nailed it. You've nailed it. Beethoven is the only one of whom we can say that what he does comes from somewhere else. We have no other rational explanation. There are, I think, four makers of Western civilization: Leonardo, Michelangelo, Shakespeare, and Beethoven. Could you imagine a world without Beethoven? Me neither. That's why Beethoven. Thank you so much.